Hey guys, what's up? What is some old fantasy that's really still good today? Is there old fantasy that's still good today? Does fantasy have a time limit where it's dated for the time the fantasy came out, and after that time it's no longer good, it's no longer applicable, you can't enjoy it because it's not your generation, it's generations before, And is old fantasy still good now? Well, I'm gonna say, well, yeah, But the thing is, that is it still good now? Is it better now than it was before? Is it worse? Is it somehow dated? Is there something about it that's not good? Or is it just old fantasy? Does it just get better? Stories like the King Arthur story, they have been retold so many freaking times that even though it's an old story, because it's being retold all the time, you get new stories that come out based on that old story. So, Netflix, you get kind of the movie Cursed, or was it a series? It was a series. Cursed. It was about King Arthur. It was about the Knights of the Round Table. It was about Morgana, Merlin, and all those characters. Excalibur, the sword, and they changed it. They were like they were all fairies instead of being human and stuff like that. They always changed it, and that's also a really good thing that I find. It's good to have old fantasy the same as it was when it was originally told that way, and I think also it's good to have the fantasy retold in a newer way. If you look at Beowulf is probably one of the oldest fantasy stories ever. If you go further than that, you go into mythology, and that's not necessarily, it wasn't treated as fantasy, even though it was fantasy, and we look at mythology now as fantasy. But back then, it was sort of like religion, but it's not sort of like the way, they didn't look at religion back then like they look at religion now. They don't look at, this, I don't know how they looked at religion, but if you look at the story, it was really intended to explain the universe and the things around them rather than an escapist story about, another genre in another time, in another place. And Beowulf, man, like the original Beowulf story, it was just retold, and it was just on Netflix, and they did a digitally animated feature, with Beowulf, and it was cool. They did it in English, which was like nice because that way, people can speak English, can understand it. I mean, it's cool if they do in other languages. It's cool if they do subtitles and whatever. I mean, that would be cool. So as many people, with different languages can watch that as possible and get understand the story of Beowulf. But they used modern technology to retell an old story, and I think we really did a good job. Because I tried to read Beowulf, I bought the book, and it's a really thin little pamphlet. It's not a long story, it's not a long book. I wanted to read it. It's an old Norse tale. I was fascinated by the Norse, by Vikings, because it's very medieval fantasy. Vikings are always in fantasy. They're fantasy elements, basically. A Viking story is a fantasy story, or it's got fantasy elements in it. It could be a historically accurate story, historically inaccurate story, or it could be drama like they do sometimes. So it could be comedy. I've seen Viking comedies, but Vikings, like when you see Vikings in a comic book or a movie or a book, a lot of times, Vikings or people that look like Vikings with swords, shields, and armor, it's a fantasy story. And so that's the thing about that fantasy story is like the Beowulf. It's one of the oldest tales in existence. And they did that. They never actually retold Gilgamesh. Gilgamesh is an old story, but it's not religious, but it's a basically hero, sort of like, it's a fantasy story, basically, And Gilgamesh basically goes all the way back to Sumerian, Babylonian. We're talking about, I don't know, 2,000 to 3,000, or even further, BC, whereas like Vikings, they're a little bit more modern. They're not as old as that. I think that the oldest fantasy story, as far as I know, that's not mythology, because mythology just is, you could look at it like it's fantasy, and they did fantasy movies based on mythology, like the one with Medusa and Perseus, Medusa. He had to slay Medusa. There was the Kraken. There was like the gods and stuff like that. Clash of the Titans. Like that story. They took basically mythology. They made it fantasy. Like if you look at the series Hercules Legendary Journey, Hercules was a mythological character. But Gilgamesh was a actual story. What's interesting about Gilgamesh is that, like, if you want to read the story of Gilgamesh, you probably just have to read it. I've never seen a movie or a comic book or anything visual or a game or anything like that based on Gilgamesh. Never really, and a lot of people, I don't know if they ever heard of Gilgamesh. You know, like you basically only hear about Gilgamesh if you study old stories, you know, and then the Gilgamesh pops up and people that study old stories like know Gilgamesh and stuff like that. It's a fantasy tale. There's gods, goddesses, monsters fighting, you know, sword, sorcery, all that stuff, magic, everything is in that story. And that story is still good today. Is it like as good now? You know, do they make better stories now than Gilgamesh? In my opinion, yes. You know, but that's kind of what happens. You know, things things evolve. But the thing is, without Gilgamesh, we might have not had the stories we have today. Like they would say something like, you know, whether someone likes or doesn't like the blues music, a lot of people would say, or musicians and people that are scholarly in music would say, without blues music, we wouldn't have had rock and roll. And without classical music, we wouldn't have had blues music, you know? You got to go all the way back to the end and be like, maybe this isn't relevant today, or I think classical music is always relevant, it's timeless, but anyway, if something just was all the way in the past and it's not relevant because it's just so far back, it might not be relevant directly, but it was the spawning of something that we have now. We wouldn't have the same fantasy stories if we didn't have the fantasy stories of the past. If there was no Gilgamesh, if there was no Beowulf, there might have not been a Conan the Barbarian. You know, if there was no Hercules, because Conan is a very Hercules kind of character, right? Conan, Hercules, very, very similar characters, except Conan is a commoner, a barbarian. Hercules is half god, half man. You know, he's divine, and his stories are basically mythological. You know, because it was Zeus and all the other gods and whatever it is that was involved in that. Where Conan, the god is Crom, you know, Crom, and the Secret of Steel, you know, and I think that's because like Steel happened a lot later than those, than the Hercules stories, because I think at some point swords were made of bronze and iron, and then later on swords were made of steel, and in the age of the swords being made of steel, there was Conan the Barbarian. So look at the old stories and look at the modern stories that are coming out, and they're amazing. The modern stories are so cool. Constantine is a cool story. Hellblazer, the newest stories, like who doesn't like the best, you know, sci-fi, fantasy books, movies, comics that are coming out now? And if you want to just go a little bit back and not like all the way back, you can go into the Michael Moorcock comics. Like the best stuff that Michael Moorcock did, he did in the 60s and 70s. And, you know, in my opinion, that was his best stuff. And he's still not really doing, I mean, I've seen he's still kind of doing Elric, and he's still doing different books with the Eternal Champion that he started in the late 60s and stuff like that. But my favorite things about Michael Moorcock's books is the Elric Saga, the Corum Saga, the Eternal Champion series, and all this was done in the late 60s and the 70s. You know, if you look at like the best stuff in Heavy Metal Magazine, the comic book magazine kind of thing that they've been doing since 1977, you could see like the best stuff they have. They have good stuff now. I will say, like, yeah, some of the stuff is entertaining and good, and the art is good, you know, and it's more modern, whatever it is. But look at the stuff though that they did in the late 70s and the 80s. And a lot of people that read Heavy Metal Magazine and like that kind of thing would say that's their best stuff. Like, it was just hard for them to maintain that. It's hard, like anyone that has anything great, it's hard to keep it going. So in the 90s, it was still kind of good, but a lot of people would say it wasn't really as good as the 70s and 80s. It's just because when you have something great, it's hard to maintain it. Look at the first 3 Star Wars movies, right? The first 3 Star Wars movies were, you know, a lot of people would say they were great movies, and they were really good movies. They were really good. I mean, it was nice. A lot of people got into them. Some people didn't get into them as much. Some people got heavily into them, you know, where it was their best favorite movies of all time. And then in, what was it, the 2000s or something like that, or the late 90s, the other Star Wars movies started coming out, and people were like, this sucks, these are horrible, you know. I didn't think they were horrible. They were okay, but they didn't compare to the first 3 movies, right? And so it's hard to keep that going. If you look at Terminator, first movie was great, and look at the other movies, it's hard to keep up with that. Conan the Barbarian, first movie was good. Conan the Destroyer, not so much. People usually don't say Conan the Destroyer was a bad movie, but it wasn't as good as Conan the Barbarian. My God, it wasn't even close to being that kind of movie. People were disappointed because it wasn't close, but in honesty, it's hard to do great things and keep it going, this is where bands that have a great song, a lot of times it's like, well, that was their great song or that was their great album, and that's it. It's like even the Beatles, they were considered one of the best bands of all time and definitely one of the most popular bands. But if you look at how many great songs they have compared to how many songs they released, it's a small portion. It's maybe 10% of the songs they actually made and released are songs that are still being played on the radio, still felt like they're, people still feel like they're relevant, and people still like, their best of is maybe 10% of the actual album. So if you buy one of their albums, you'll notice one or two songs that you recognize, and the rest is just other Beatles stuff that no one's ever heard of. Basically, it's just only Beatles fans heard of it. But even Led Zeppelin, there's a few good songs. They're considered one of the best bands of all time. A few good songs, and the rest of them, if you're a fan, you'll like all of them or most of them. But if you just casually like them, whatever, you might not like, you might like some songs more than others. But anyway, and so that's the thing, about older stories. It's like two things happen to them. One is they're just still good today, and the other thing that's good is they evolve. They change. Your hero stories that are relevant now were inspired by hero stories of an earlier time. I think the older stuff is still relevant. But, however, if you watch Clash of the Titans now, you will see that it wasn't the story. The story was amazing. Everything was good. Is the graphics, these special effects were dated, right? They had to use a lot of practical special effects. They had the monsters were like these claymation, sort of like these clay characters with stop motion, photography, which they moved them a little bit here and there and take a picture of moving them and stuff like that. And what would happen is that, so they would put all these pictures together while slowly moving the character, and it looked like the monster was moving a little bit. They did that with the Medusa, the Kraken, the monster guy with the whip, that story. They did a lot of it. They did a lot. They had the little owl, which was a mechanical owl, which is interesting because I didn't know they had robots back then, but I guess they did, according to the movie. But everything else, there was nothing really different about it. There was nothing dating it to 1980s and stuff like that. There was nothing dating it to that time, right? It could have basically came out at any time because it was based on the real story of Medusa, which was mythology. Perseus was mythological, So a lot of what's interesting is that the dawn of fantasy is an offshoot of mythology, or an offshoot of also like polytheism. It's just like an older time where magic was believed in. And magic was believed in. They were wizards and they were like magic swords and stuff like that. And if you look at a lot of older stories, like it was all about magic and swords and heroes and weapons and items and things like that. Like the people are still looking for the Holy Grail. They don't know if it's real or not, whether it actually exists or not. But there are people out there that are doing the whole Indiana Jones thing, going all over, like finding caves and, older monasteries and whatever it is where people used to live, and digs to find, not only the Holy Grail, but any old artifacts. And they haven't found any of it, They haven't found any artifacts, but all they find is like old swords, old rings, old things that, ancient people wore and stuff like that. But magical artifacts, if they found it, no one's heard about it. Like they don't really talk about it. Which makes sense. If someone finds, the Holy Grail, they probably wouldn't tell everybody about it because people would say, "Oh, that belongs to me," because everyone's after the Holy Grail. Like the story, the Inkle, like the main character of the story, possesses the object, the Inkle, and when like and everyone's after him for that inkle. So you don't want to have something that everybody wants, or they'll pretty much get after you trying to get it. And so that's the thing about older stories. On the one hand, you got to respect them because they're the people that grew up with the older stories are the people that are making the newer stories, On the other hand, I haven't seen a lot of newer stories that's better than the Elric saga with Michael Moorcock, better than a lot, like, has there been like any, if you look at something like The Lord of the Rings and Tolkien and The Hobbit, has there been another story with some kind of a halfling character? Not really. The Hobbit is a standalone story. There's never been a hero that was like the Hobbit. Most heroes are strong or, somehow powerful, where the Hobbit, he was just basically just a character, didn't even want to go on an adventure. He just wanted to stay home in his house and eat 6 times a day. That's what Hobbit wanted to do, but he had to do this whole journey and stuff like that, And so you really, even though I do think you can still enjoy old stories now, and I think a lot of ways, I think the old stories are just as good as the new stories. But then on top of that, because of the evolution of stories and because things keep changing and evolving, things actually get better, even though like sequels are not as good as the original sometimes. But little by little over time, when there's real, inspiration there, you can get newer stories that are truly, truly great on their own. So thanks for watching, guys. I hope you enjoyed the video. Like and subscribe. Check out my other videos. Let me know what you're thinking in the comments, and I will see you guys in another video later.